I feel like this is pretty much set in stone. If you are experiencing less than 35 frames to 40 frames per second in PvP, you are essentially handicapping yourself and your guild. Hey, what's up guys, it's your boy Benzi, and today I'm coming to you with a video on Black Desert Online. Now Black Desert Online is a fairly new MMO, and like new MMOs, they require stronger PCs with more up-to-date parts. But today's video, we're going to talk about how to improve your frames per second given the PC parts that you have, in certain situations like riding your horse through major cities and in medium to large scale PvP. So without further ado, let's get into the details of the video. Now first of all, let's start learning the specifics here, because there's a lot of settings in this game, and at the end of the day we have to find the perfect margin between performance and making the game not look like RuneScape, if that's what you're looking for. And that is completely base by base, for each player to decide for themselves, but for the purpose of the video, we are going to min-max our PC specs to accommodate large-scale PvP. I'm not talking like 50v50 node war, I'm talking like 100 versus 100 versus 100 sieges, like very large-scale PvP. And we're going to go through each setting and explain what it does and how effective it is, and maybe we'll even order at the end of the video the importance of each setting being as low as possible, or checked off or not. So let's jump right into it. Currently we play on windowed mode. I don't have conclusive evidence to show that playing in different modes of screens actually improves frames per second. So that's up for you guys to decide. I'm not sure if that changes across operating systems or GPUs. We want 1920 by 1080 to have a reasonably sized game, so that's pretty standard. You guys can go lower, obviously. This will dramatically improve your gameplay, but there's also another way to change your screen resolution without playing around with this constantly. So when we get into texture quality and graphic quality, generally speaking we want this as low as possible for node wars and sieges, just because the less particles your GPU has to render, the less work it has to do, and the less potential for it to be overloaded with work and force your CPU to compensate. And we don't want that, because this game is extremely CPU intensive, and the last thing you want is your GPU needing compensation. So let's take a look at the other settings. Oh, well, generally I use low, but if it comes to massive large scale PvP, I'll use optimization mode, but that's only for extreme examples. Okay, jumping into the other settings, we got anti-aliasing SSAO. Now generally these settings are pretty significant. They'll improve your frames by 2 to 5 depending on the scale of PvP, but generally speaking, having these unchecked makes your game look extremely sharp and pale, which, don't get me wrong, is actually very helpful during nighttime, and if you're trying to distinguish players from objects, you can with these sharp borders you can tell distinctively what everything is and looks like. But it also looks like your eyes are being stabbed, so some people preferably don't like those settings. Me personally, I've been playing with these two settings off for the longest time just to improve my frames, but now that I've been overclocking my GPU from 3.4 GHz to 4.2, it's not so much of a big deal, and I can afford to have it checked off just for that smoother edges on objects. Okay, screen filtering, high-end mode, hit effects. You can also check this off. It'll improve your frames during winter seasons. Show workers blood on display. All these settings, just to take them off. None of them are required. None of them actually help you see anything. Maybe depth of field you can apply just so you can see far away objects better, but honestly, if you can't see it already, it's because it's out of your render range and you don't really need to see it to begin with. So preferably, it's pretty straightforward. Have everything checked off the way I do here, and it'll all make sense when you see that your frames are already improving. Okay, next off we have Auto Frame Optimizer. Now this is debatably a good and bad thing. For me, I feel like this is huge, because having the ability to see player effects in node wars, and sometimes in small examples in sieges, is a huge deal, because if you're like me, you're playing a skirmisher, the last thing you want to do is run into a Witcher wizard and you're unable to see their hand animations, and they just one-shot you with their ultimate, or a wizard ultimate, or some kind of stupid witch skill. So for me, personally, having auto frame optimizer apply player skills when I have safe frames is a huge deal for me, because it just means I'm going to survive that much longer. I feel like this is pretty much set in stone. If you are experiencing less than 35 frames to 40 frames per second in PvP, you are essentially handicapping yourself and your guild. So the purpose of this video is to maximize your frames, not only maximize your frames, but also to improve your frames per second in all situations to the point where you're guaranteed at least 35. Let's move on to crop. Okay, crop is what I was speaking about, changing your resolution. So without actually playing around with your screen size and just having your screen shrink and shrink and shrink based on what you've adjusted it to most recently, you can go with the cropped option. Now the cropped option does look unappealing at first, but this is probably one of the most dramatic changes you can make to help improve your gaming performance. So what cropped does is essentially it doesn't render any particle within the black area. So if there are objects there on your screen, or if anything, like spell effects being casted, it reduces the amount of particles that need to be rendered, and therefore dramatically improves frames. We go with you can also crop vertical. I strongly recommend cropping your screen if you have a very, very bad CPU. We're talking like, under 4 gigahertz. Because when it comes to BDO, this is the most effective thing to improve your performance. And when you're at very, very large scale PvP, just one click of the button on crop screen will dramatically improve your system performance. I only use crop for large node war fights where there's more than a few hundred people that show up, multiple guilds, and sieges. Because I'm at 4.2 gigahertz currently, and I feel like that's enough to stay above 40 frames per second in Red Battlefield and most PvP scenarios, including world bosses. So let's jump into the next skills. So if you don't have auto frame optimizer checked off, I strongly recommend checking off remove other effects, because any sort of effect spamming in large scale PvP will immediately make you useless. It'll destroy your frames per second, which most of you already know when you go to world bosses. You've been checking that off as is. Okay, so graphic low power mode. If you're like superstitious like me and you just want your PC to run as cool as possible, I check off this option right here. Basically, essentially what it does is it feeds your GPU. It doesn't overfeed your GPU with electricity, meaning your GPU won't overheat to work itself to render any sort of animations or effects or any sort of rendering. And just capping this off feeds your GPU, the normal amounts required for making the game run, rendering your skills and animations, and essentially not burning it out with sudden flashy effects and anything like that. Essentially making your computer parts live longer. Okay, upscale. This setting basically makes your game look like RuneScape. Significantly improves your system performance as well. If this is a setting I would also use in Siege, because when it comes to 300 people being on your screen, the last thing you want to worry about is how fuzzy your character looks. And when you're doing RBFs, you can hardly notice this setting's even on. So upscaling, also a very, very effective method into improving your FPS. So between upscaling and cropping, even if you have a bad CPU, you should be able to improve your frame rate by, I don't know, 10 to 20 frames per second, depending on how many people you have to render. So let's jump into the other settings. Now these settings are pretty straightforward. All we have to do is turn off all the flashiness. Turning off these settings will improve your frames per second, but not as dramatic as the other changes. So if you do enjoy, your shaky effects, your after image, and all these random effects when you grind and stuff like that, just to make the PvP or the content feel more dramatic, then by all means keep these settings applied. It's not going to destroy your frames per second, but it will make your GPU run a lot hotter than it needs to, and ultimately reducing its lifespan. So for me, I turn all these settings off. We have zoom in and out effect settings off, camera angle effect off, camera after image effects off, camera shake settings off, all camera effects off, So basically everything off as you see here. To be honest, I'd just recommend doing, if you haven't already, I'd recommend changing your settings accordingly to the way I have it right now, because this will improve your frame rate and not make your game run horribly when traveling through cities or RBFs or even node wars. So generally speaking, this is what I like to run for most of the time. Sometimes I'll go to graphic medium and texture quality medium, depending on how hot my computer components are running. But generally speaking, this is min-maxed settings for a healthy BDO game application to run. Everything else seems pretty much okay. So that's it for the settings, guys. So from comparing where I am currently with my settings to what I would do for Siege, the only difference I would do for Siege is uncheck this, so my GPU performs harder if needed in certain situations. I'll crop my screen and I'll upscale, and essentially my game looks like crap, but I have insane frames per second in large scale PvP. And for some reason my frames, or since recording, my frames have been really low, but currently, even without these settings, I usually run 60 FPS in Calphion City. Alright guys, so that's it for the interior changes that we can make to improve your FPS in Black Desert Online large scale PvP. Now we're going to take a look at quickly some things you could do outside of the game without changing your registries and your GPU control panel, and still help the game perform better than it currently is. So we're just going to very simply go to Task Manager. If you don't know how to do so, you just right click your bottom bar at the bottom of your screen and click Task Manager. And for Windows 10 users, we have to go to Details, but for Windows 7 and 8, I'm pretty sure you could just right click the game itself and prioritize its importance. So for Windows 10 users, we go to Details and right click Black Desert Online, set priority to above normal. And essentially all this does is, if Windows 10 starts deciding to download porn or to do some random ass update that you didn't give authorization to, it'll prioritize the game and not hinder its performance, but at the same time still doing whatever Windows needs to do. Maybe it's that time of night and Windows needs to get off, nobody knows. So having this set to priority above normal is safe. High, you risk the game crashing. I feel like that's potentially what happened to me just the other day. So I just recommend above normal, just in case if something else has to run and is extremely important, your computer doesn't have to compete between the high performance or the Black Desert Online application being set to high and whatever downloading or updating needs to be prioritized as well. So that's very straightforward. This will only improve your performance if something else is running in the background that you either shouldn't be, or that is taking too much CPU speed when it shouldn't be. The second most important thing is going into your control panel and turning off Coherent UI, which I have already done. So essentially what Coherent UI is, the application that is designed to run the Black Spirits adventure. So if you do turn off the Coherent UI, remember that your Black Spirit basically won't work, as well as searching up guild rank and probably a few other things. I guess notice as well. So just having Coherent UI is a huge change you can make, because although you won't notice it to start, if you are running through a city or you're in large-scale PvP with lots of rendering going on, it's going to be extremely difficult for your computer to run the in-game UI as well as all the crazy shit that's happening around you. So that's it for the exterior things and for the interior things. Now to quickly go over the importance of all the settings in order, I feel like the most important or dramatic changes you can make are crop and upscaling, and making sure graphic card low power mode is also unchecked. These are the three most crucial things that I mess around with when it comes to sieges. But if I'm not in a siege, this is generally what these settings look like to allow me to see skills in certain situations and to still be effective and relative in PvP without running below 35 frames per second. Secondly is to lower your texture quality and graphic quality accordingly. Again, optimization mode is probably best for sieges, because you really don't need to care about how your screen looks or your character looks when you have 100 people zerging you. So this is the second most important thing you could do to improve your game performance and frames per second. And finally, the third most important thing is to just play around with these scroll bars over here and turn off all the flashy effects, all the dynamic camera effects, because at the end of the day that'll affect your frames per second, and it makes your combat look more flashy than it needs to be. So that's it for the changes, guys, and I was hoping to show you some Red Battlefield to prove the difference in performance. The first few minutes being the settings that I'm currently running, and then the next part using cropped screen and upscale just to show you the dramatic change in performance. Unfortunately, Red Battlefield really doesn't have enough players to see the massive difference, but essentially we had about 60 people online in Red Battlefield yesterday, 50 to 60 people online yesterday, and consistently during the midst of fights with these settings currently, I had around 40 to 45 frames per second, and the most in the biggest clashes of fights. So when we went balls to the wall in the enemy team to get kills, essentially those were my frames, 40 to 45 per second, which is competitive. I can still be effective for my guilds, for myself in Siege, but at the same time I don't have to make the game look a little uglier than it has to be. So I went back in. This is a new Red Battlefield. Again, it's 50 to 60 people, and we did crop and upscale, and we took off graphic low power mode, and our game essentially looked like spaghetti. But we had, in the heaps of battle, we had almost 55 frames per second consistently. Sometimes we dropped down to high 49s. So what does that say about the frames per second? Essentially, you're getting 5 to 10 frames improved in a situation that only has 60 people. So 5 to 10 frames difference with 60 people in your Red Battlefield, that would mean if there's 200 people in your Siege, you'd be getting 4 times the frames. So we're talking about 20 to 40 frames per second increase if you were to upscale use the upscale setting as well as the crop setting. So that's kind of a food for thought. I mean, that's very subjective depending on how many people are actually on your screen, how many people are actually casting skills. But generally speaking, if it's literally straight up Zerg and everybody's mashing keys, having the settings alternatively with upscale and crop screen will improve your system performance dramatically, guaranteed. So that's it for the video, guys. I'll throw in some Red Battlefields just for the lulz. Thank you for watching. I hope this is educational and you guys can play around these settings to your will and generally make you guys more effective in PvP with not making the game look like RuneScape. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.